Hello, and welcome to the So Emotional podcast. Here on the cast, we discuss everything emotions through the lens of attachment, the nervous system, and internal parts work. We're a little irreverent and like to have fun exploring the emotional issues and dynamics that interest us. So come along and hang out. Let's explore the fascinating lands of emotions.
Hi, everyone. Welcome back to the So Emotional podcast. I'm your host, Angela, with Epic Initiator Coaching. We also have Nick Carl with us. He's the Safe Anchor, somatic coach, and we have a very special guest today, John Ford. And I'm going to read parts of his bio, and he's going to share more with us. But the purpose of the So Emotional podcast has always been and is to clear up the enigma and stigma around the emotional journey, to help you feel more normal and for us to just, I think, get along better with each other, which is why we have a fantastic episode for you coming up. So John Ford is a seasoned workplace mediator and soft skills trainer, which he's going to tell us more about, with over 35 years of experience in conflict resolution, which I think we will need now more than ever, just looking at everything going on in the world. He is the creator of the Empathy Set, a tool comprising cards designed to identify feelings and needs, promoting emotional intelligence and relational harmony. This tool has been adapted to the Empathy Set app, extending its accessibility and impact. And I personally use it. It's actually a very cool tool. John teaches negotiation and mediation at UC Law, San Francisco, formerly UC Hastings, and has authored Peace at Work, the HR Manager's Guide to Workplace Mediation, a comprehensive resource for HR professionals. His work is deeply influenced by the principles of nonviolent communication, aiming to foster empathy and understanding in both personal and professional settings. Thank you so much, John, for joining us today. I'm very excited.
Thank you. Great to be here with you and Nick.
With you. So one of the first things that we like to dive in with our guests on is reflecting back to that moment. I feel like it's sort of a come to Jesus moment, or like an oh shit moment, where you're like, wait a second, emotions are very important and I'm probably missing something here. So if you have something like that, I would love to hear more about it.
My journey to emotions. I grew up in a family that was what I'd call kind of waspy. So feelings weren't really the centerpiece. I don't remember being sort of encouraged to get in touch with feelings. And I think I sort of pretty much got through childhood pretty disconnected from what I feel and how I relate to the world in terms of feelings and the like. If you'd asked me, I'd have probably said, I don't get angry. And that continued for the most part until I started down my path as being a mediator. And that was really when I started realizing that, wow, there are these things called emotions. I was starting to see them in the participants that were in my mediations, and appreciating that working with the emotional energy was really important. And as I realized that, it also sort of forced me to start looking at my own emotional landscape. I'm not sure that I had one of those sort of aha moments that I could sort of define at a particular point in time, but more just to say that to me was really the start of opening me up to, wow, there are these things called emotions, and I need to start exploring that. And I would just say I don't want to say I haven't looked back, but that journey, I've continued down that path to where I am today, and really now understand how much anger I still have from my past that I haven't integrated, because all those years that I didn't think I was experiencing anger, I was, of course, but I was just suppressing it. And I'm doing my best to clear that, to do my work as it relates to, particularly as it relates to anger. And also, I feel like I'm on a little bit of a mission to liberate anger from its, I don't know, it's the demonization of anger as being the problem. Because what I've really discovered is that anger, like all emotions, are giving me information, they're giving me energy, and anger tells me I care strongly about something that's important to me, and my strategy to address what's important to me isn't working. And then I get this sort of like whoosh of energy that comes up through my body and helps to guide me. So I've really I'm happy to report that I've made a friend of it. But that, as I say, it's been a long journey.
love that because I feel like you and I are definitely fellow travelers on that journey. Simply because my dad, I would describe as a rageaholic, and I always had a very, yeah, interesting relationship with anger, and it's been a big part of my life's work to integrate that and not be afraid of it and such.
Hmm.
So I love that you said that. One of the things I was going to ask you, so what was it that led you to become a lawyer and then later get into mediation?
Well, I often sort of reflect on how hard it is as a, 17, 18-year-old to figure out what it is you're going to do in your life. I suppose some people have clarity. I know that I didn't, but what didn't seem to be negotiable was whether I was going to go to university or not. So it was really like, you're going to go, and then it's what are you going to do? And I was born in South Africa, and there was apartheid. And to me, what I was aware of was that there was something wrong in my society. It didn't feel right. And again, it's, looking back, hard to sort of pinpoint exactly how I came to that decision. But um, my late father had been a doctor, so there was a certain amount of pressure for me to go in that direction. But my grades weren't quite in the ballpark to get me there. And so I had to sort of say, well, law seemed like a not such a bad choice after all. And again, it did tie in with my concerns about the quality of human experiences in my country. So that was really how, sorry, how I got there. I should also mention that by the time I did go to university and study law, I'd already spent 2 years in the South African Air Force. It's not my proudest moment, but I also have forgiven myself and my mother for sending me off as a 17-year-old into the military. And what I appreciated, especially when I got to the University of Cape Town, where I studied, which was a progressive liberal university, was that I got to re-explore the history of South Africa and what was going on, and really understand the nature of the conflict there, and got involved in student politics. So there was an organization called the End Conscription Campaign that I was a part of. And so that was, at that point, I suppose I was more in what I'd sort of see in the advocacy trenches of trying to fight for what I believed was right. And eventually, after I'd graduated from law school, I moved to Namibia, where I'd been deployed as a guard at an air base, as a way really of making amends and joining in the struggle there and fighting for human rights, because Namibia at that time was still colonized by South Africa. And it was while I was there working as an attorney in Namibia that I started mediating. And it wasn't that I trained as a mediator; it just seemed to make sense to me that when two people were in conflict, and it was in particular in the context of divorces, where the one spouse would come in and say they wanted something civil, and the other would go and see another attorney, and then all hell would break loose. And I'd be like, what happened to that civility that we were talking about? So I wouldn't, when a client came to me and said they wanted to keep it civil, I'd say, if you want to keep it civil, bring your spouse into my office. I know it's strictly speaking unethical, but we'll see if we can work something out in my office. As I say, I hadn't trained as a mediator, but that's essentially what I was doing. And I subsequently discovered that was also how a lot of people got their start in mediation here. But that really was my path to mediation. I also did a little bit of labor work. And so I got asked to sit as the chairperson of conciliation boards between the union and the company. And again, I thought I was as you heard me saying, I was the chairperson of the conciliation board, but I hadn't trained as a mediator. And it was only when I got to the United States that I was like, oh, wow, there's a whole field of mediation. You can train as a mediator. And I would say I never looked back. So I suppose in some ways I stumbled into it in the happenstance way that life sometimes unfolds.
Does classic mediator training have these emotional components baked into the classic training, or was the emotional parts, the stuff that you ended up building these tools out of, is that something that you kind of carved out for yourself, or what type of dimensions were
I like
present?
that question, Nick. So I would say nowadays, yes, working with emotions is very much part of any standard mediation training. But I recall it was around about 2000, and a colleague of mine, Eileen Barker, and I got asked to take over a training at a local university in the Bay Area. And it had been delivered by someone that we knew, So we're looking at the materials and noting that there wasn't any attention on the emotional component. And around about that time, we'd got a book by a guy called Ken Cloak, and he's the founder of Mediators Beyond Borders. And he'd written a book called, I think it was called Risky Mediation or something like that. I forget the exact title. I got it in my bookcase behind me here, but he put a lot of attention on the emotional component. And I remember sort of us almost like looking at one another and saying, we can't leave this out. And I think now in hindsight, looking back, as I say, that was probably around about this time, I think that in a general way, that role of emotion was starting to come to the fore as being vital for any mediators training. I also had the good fortune of picking up a part-time job working for Mediate.com. And in my role there as the editor uploading articles, I started sort of seeing that trend of people starting to write more and more about the role of emotions. That said, I'd say there are still a lot of mediators. There's my practice of mediation is more focused on the workplace. I sort of chose to swim upstream away from the courthouse and to try to get to conflict earlier. And at that point, it's much more relational and it is much more emotional. By the time conflicts end up in the legal system, they're often more transactional. They're more about the money. And the mediators of those disputes are often retired judges. And so a lot of them are carrying their experience from conducting settlement conferences and the like, and haven't always had that kind of training and don't necessarily have that comfort. And I've sort of picked up concerns that people will express that they will sometimes be uncomfortable with emotionality, and rather than working with that emotional energy will almost suppress it. But I would say that has been the journey in our field to appreciate the role of emotion and conflict resolution.
I know that we start off, you mentioned anger, right? And so anger is an emotion that we've talked about. And we talk a lot about parts work and also things getting displaced. And I know that just in my own journey of working with my own emotions, that dealing with anger, and then anger sort of goes up into rage, is at least for me personally, and I think that what I see out in the polis, in the people, of just what is happening in society, is that anger ends up being one of the most sort of disabused, disassociated forms of information and emotionality that exists. I wonder if that's something that you also see in mediation in your roles, that like maybe anger doesn't always play a part in like the conflicts, but it's always usually a piece of the puzzle somewhere.
Yeah, I'm not sure that I've ever mediated whether some degree of anger emotionality wasn't present. And as you rightly point out, there is kind of a continuum. I sort of always use a shorthand of fear, sadness, and anger as the big three. And then, like the old-fashioned radio where you sort of first tune into the channel and then you try and adjust the volume. It's like which channel is playing anger, fear, or sadness, and sometimes all three of them, and what's the level of intensity. So sometimes it might be annoyance or irritation before it gets to that point. What I've also found is sort of similar to what we refer to as faux or sort of non-feeling words, is that anger is often a gateway to other deeper emotions. And again, partly because of the way we're socialized. So for example, for a male to display anger is, maybe not necessarily desirable, but it's not necessarily going to be frowned on in the same way that maybe when a woman does. And so sometimes a person will be comfortable expressing anger or sometimes not. And then as the mediator, I will be exploring or probing to see if there maybe beneath that anger is actually an emotion that, again, for the males, maybe isn't socially permissible, like being afraid or being sad and tearing up, those sort of things. So, but yeah, as I say, I don't think there's ever been a time where there hasn't been some degree of that present in the mediations that I do.
I find that anger is usually this emotion that can come up that's, sort of like the human version of like the blowfish, where it's like we make ourselves
Yeah, yeah,
bigger
yeah.
to feel powerful because there's something underneath that doesn't feel very powerful or stable. And actually what you said is like a very vulnerable emotion that wasn't allowed to be felt, or that isn't socially acceptable or permissible for that gender.
Hmm.
And and I think also it sort of depends on that person's own like family culture as well as the larger culture. And I think there's like layers to it. There was something you said earlier, it's still in the vein of anger, but you were saying that you didn't realize that you had so much anger and that you were suppressing it.
Hmm.
Do you have an idea of what was going on there, or what originally had happened? I mean, you don't have to go into too much detail, but I
Hmm.
was curious about the way that you spoke about that. And there was something else that you mentioned about joining the Air Force in South Africa and forgiving yourself and your mother for having done that. So those things have just kind of been in my mind. But if
Okay,
you
well,
want to,
you can help me if I drop some of what you shared, but I'll do my best.
I'll
So the
remind
first
you
one,
if you do. Sorry.
but the first thing I would just to point to, they've done research where they say when people are angry, there is literally energy that's moving up the body into the hands, which is often why it leads to violence, sort of the slamming of the door. I don't know how many mediations where it's like and then he hit the wall and his hand went through the wall kind of thing. That there's a lot of energy in that. And conversely, when people experience fear, the energy goes down to the feet so that they can run. So I think you're right. It is big energy. It is that kind of blowfish energy. And then in terms of that experience that I had as a child, um, I think my kind of conclusion is we all have difficult experiences growing up. Some are just stressful. Some rise to sort of a dissociative, sort of traumatic kind of a level. And again, depending on the family of origin that we're raised in, we'll either be coached and supported to feel what we're feeling and to start, getting that information. So no one taught me to suppress what I was feeling, but I did have my parents as role models who were adept at sweeping everything under the carpet. Um, and what I've come to sort of see is that I have a lot as the way, I suppose maybe the best way I can sort of speak to this is to say, I think it was in about 2007, someone gave me a book called The Presence Process. And that was a game changer for me because it gave me the technology. That's the way I look at it, is to stop compounding the original pain and to start reducing that pain. And the simple sort of technique was when I would get triggered, as the author sort of suggested, and this is a hard thing to do. He'd say the first step is to dismiss the messenger. That the messenger, the person that stimulated your anger, is not the issue, and not to get entangled with them. That's not easy because there is often something that needs to be addressed out there in the world. But ultimately, I learn and I've practiced. I'm not always perfect at it, but I consistently do. When something comes up in my present day life, and I realize I've been triggered, I'm aware that one of my core woundings that I sort of need to work on relates to anger. And that to me, what I've really discovered is all the times where I didn't speak up for myself, where something was happening that I didn't feel was right, and that I was socialized and sort of trained to just basically suck it up and not to express myself. So there's a myriad of those kind of experiences that I had during my childhood. And I used to sort of think of myself, well, as I said, I didn't think I got angry. I thought I was just like an easygoing, nice guy. What I was horrified to discover in later life, again, especially as I was working as a mediator, is the danger of suppressing, especially anger, is that we end up being passive aggressive. And that was really a hard moment of looking in my mirror and realizing that. But in any event, just to come back to say that once I've identified, recognized I've been triggered, this person is my messenger, they've stimulated the anger within me. What I then will do is I'll try and trace it back to those earlier years. I don't always come to a specific incident. Certainly around the anger, it's been a more generic thing. Some of my other, I suppose, wounding, I've been able to get to specific incidents. And this is the sort of the simple but also hard thing to do, is to feel it, to heal it. In other words, to allow myself to feel what I'd originally resisted feeling. And everything up to that point is more mental. In other words, realizing I've been triggered. That's sort of like I have a cognitive awareness of that, realizing that I'm experiencing anger, reflecting on my earlier childhood and those experiences where I didn't express myself. That's all sort of cognitive mental. But then when I say to myself, feel it to heal it, that actually was a long journey to really develop an ability to do that, because the minute I'd sort of say feel it to heal it, I could sort of see that I wouldn't want to go there. And so for myself, I'll share, I've developed a technique for myself that when I realize, especially with the anger, what I do is I put my hands on my belly and I say, instead of resisting it, let's be curious about it. It's your anger, John. Where is it in your body? Let's feel it. Let's not stop trying to push it away. Let's literally make friends with it. And what I've consistently found when I do that, when I can really sort of connect with it and hold my hands on my belly and breathe deeply into my belly doing that, it's almost like there's this like poof, and there's a release. I always wish that would be the end of it. And someone once pointed out to me is, if you imagine for each of your core wounding sort of threads, you have a big vat of unintegrated emotional energy. So each time someone stimulates you and you can connect it with that unintegrated emotion from the past and you can feel it, the person suggested it's like you're opening the tap and letting some of that emotional energy out. So I like to think that I'm slowly reducing that unintegrated emotional charge that I've been carrying around in my life, that again, and I think we see it in our society where people do have that unintegrated charge where it's like, I just said, pass me the salt. And it's like, pass me the salt. Like you think, and then off then you're like, oh, I've hit it, I've hit a tripwire here. So anyway, that's my work. Now I'll just quickly say, in mediation, it's not therapy. So I seldom, I'd say, get to explore things in that way, but every now and then that comes up. But that to me, I would sort of say was an outgrowth of that interest and that exploration of the role of emotion, and getting beyond just reducing emotional charge in the moment. In other words, having a calming routine, which I think is important, and recognizing the importance of, after you've calmed yourself down, to go home and do your work. So I think, I don't know if I got to it all.
Well, I probably said like three things and then asked you like two questions, which is a little bit of fire hosing, so I'm sorry about that. But something you said, it was like so juicy to just listen to you speak about that, because something you said was that as humans, we have a habit of compounding our trauma. So it's like we'll have our original wound or incident that we don't get to resolve, that remains as that trapped energy in our bodies. And then those parts of us, I feel, become very hyper vigilant. And it's like we want to prevent that thing or that feeling from ever happening again. So we develop all these defenses and armoring and strategies to keep ourselves safe. Meanwhile, if you have a part that's super hyper vigilant on preventing that, since we are powerful creators, it's like very interesting to find that all those protective measures and all that attention on what we don't want to have happen actually causes what we don't want to have happen. And then it cements this idea that like this thing keeps happening to me. And I think likely what you're seeing in mediation is people have their original trauma that's been compounded,
Mhm,
compounded,
mhm, mhm,
and now
mhm,
they have a circumstance in their life where they've attracted a new actor, new
mhm,
character, or
mhm, mhm,
player to
mhm,
play out that same trauma again
mhm,
at a
mhm,
different time, in a
mhm,
different setting, in a different
mhm,
way, but it's
mhm.
still tied to the original bullshit, which is
Yes,
so
yes,
deep and so
yes,
buried. And
yes.
I love the way that you walked us through that because you said, I want to take my attention off. It's like if we're aware that we're running the whole production, if I
Mm-hmm.
can take my attention off of the actor that I've cast to play in that role and look at what script I've written, to look at what I'm fucking producing here, then it's like, oh, wait a second. I'm the one that's been
Mm-hmm.
contributing to this whole
Mm-hmm.
artistic
Mm-hmm.
production.
Mm-hmm.
And now, yes, I can resolve this, if, I put a pin in it, resolve it. But if I don't come to myself and take full responsibility for my artistic creation, then I'm just going to play that victimization
Mm-hmm.
role again, where I switch all the different seats and feel trapped until I actually take the time to address it within myself. And then the other part of it, I think, becomes is because there's been so much compounding trauma, like you said, that there's a vat of shit. Like, you didn't say shit. I know I'm the one
Mm-hmm.
that's trying to like bring in all the cursing, but
Right.
this vat of
Mm-hmm.
these compounded emotional flavors that have just been
Mm-hmm.
building because of this wound. And
Mm-hmm.
like, there's more that we're creating unless we release it. And now we actually have to start chiseling away like all that shit to get to the core of it. And it can take some time. But when these practices have been in action for decades, multiple decades, people think, I'm going to do ayahuasca or I'm going to do something and it's just going to go away. I'm going to solve it. I'm going to become
Mm-hmm.
enlightened.
Mm-hmm.
Unfortunately, it can be a little bit more like chiseling your way through a mountain sometimes to like find all those little compartments, and that you have to slowly work through all that compounding trauma that you've created from that original incident. And I do believe that we can solve things quickly. I think sometimes we can
Mm-hmm.
remove that core issue and it can be like Jenga where everything
Mm-hmm.
falls and we can resolve
Mm-hmm.
it. But I think at times it's like these issues are interconnected to many different traumas. And where we find that, it's almost like this big boss or like Gordian knot of our stuff where there's just so many different threads and it can be a little bit more complicated around finding the stories that we're writing when there's so many subplots and sub-stories that we're, bringing together. Anyway, just
I
like,
think also to that point though, I think something that John said, which is key, and I mean absolutely key, is
mhm,
actually befriending those emotions.
yes.
Because if you take an adversarial stance with them, well, then it's just you're not going to be able to interface with them. Either that you're trying to push them away, you're trying to think them away
Mm-hmm.
with your ego. It's just it's adversarial to what you actually want to do, and it is tough because a lot of times those stored emotions come at a certain psi, at a certain resonance and a frequency that are not comfortable.
Right.
Right. And sitting with uncomfortability, guess what? It doesn't feel good. Right. But then to bring your compassion and your care, which is absolutely key, to those feelings and to be with them. Right.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, I'm loving hearing what the two of you are reflecting back as we're having this conversation together. And to me, there's a tragic element when we come back to the compounding piece of how we're, in some senses, fighting with life, which is naturally regenerative. It naturally wants to give us that opportunity to be whole, and we keep, missing that opportunity because we have that mindset that, like as you're Nick saying, like discomfort and someone doing something to me that stimulates something like, I can't believe this is happening again. Instead of saying, well, maybe there's a reason why it's happening again, because here's life co-creating that sort of script for you to do that healing. And yes, there are medicines out there, like as you mentioned, ayahuasca, that can really be helpful for folks that are um, or disassociated from an experience in childhood that they're not even aware of how it's creating that chaos or mayhem in their lives, and can help to surface it. And yes, sometimes there can be, instant gratification or instant breakthroughs, but I think for the most part, the work still needs to be done, and it's more that humble acceptance, as I think as Ram Dass once said, no one's fully cooked. We're all sort of, on the path, and we just have to, as I say, maintain that humility and just keep moving forward and accepting that, okay, there's something more for me. Or as I've discovered, as I've worked through certain issues, and I'll think, oh, good, that's all. I'm getting close to taking it out of the oven, only to discover suddenly something completely new comes up, often as a result of, say, a new relationship or meeting someone new. But the other thing I think that what we're talking about is so important. And then the other dilemma I do think that we face, as much as we want to dismiss the messenger and sort of recognize that they're the stimulus of our inner discomfort and that we need to feel it and befriend it, as Nick's saying. And then we also have, when we do that first, it positions us better to be able to have the conversation with that person and maybe give them some feedback of, hey, in the future, you don't need to be communicating to me like that, because thank you, I've got the message. And in other words, adjusting things in the external 3D world as we're, even as we recognize that the true stimulus point is within us.
It sounds like what you're saying, John, is that like you've been doing this whole journey finding out that it's an internal mediation that you do first, and then bring the wisdom and you bring everything from that externally. And that's really how the external conflict is actually resolved one way or another, is through, like doing this work, because we can try to fix that external thing. But if we don't solve this, there's gonna be a new, lawsuit or new mediation or thing that we're gonna create again, because we're not.
And then also you mentioned IFS and the parts. So those, I think when we're talking about those hidden or suppressed parts, those really are the exiles. And then as children, we do develop those protective strategies where we try to anticipate, or I'm not going to go to that because I know I'll be embarrassed, so I'm going to stay away and deprive myself of an enriching kind of an opportunity. Or someone's just stepped on my toe and I need to like put them in the firefighting kind of parts. And I think, but beneath all of that, there still is that, what I just see as that foundational work of, in a compassionate way with our little inner child, holding that space for that compassionate feel it to heal it kind of a process. And then I do think sometimes where it also can be helpful is shifting our beliefs around our protective strategies, or the wisdom of screaming back at someone when they've hurt your feelings, where you can start again at a more cognitive level, reprogramming yourself. But to my mind, though, the piece that holds everything in place is that underlying emotional energy. And so, I can tell myself at a more cognitive, mental level, this is what I believe in, this is how I want to show up. But I've kind of come to conclude that we're way, way, way more emotional than we are rational, and that it's really, for the most part, when we're talking about my rationality, it's just that I'm sort of reverse engineering back to my feelings, and that my rationality is somehow trying to dress up or make sense of what I'm truly feeling.
So truly feeling, and we mentioned this a little bit before, but talking about the layered nature of feelings, right? And so I think that this plays into, I could be wrong, about the empathy set, right? About starting with one feeling, and it can go into another feeling, right? Like I can remember a specific time where I was working. Oh, no, you got some. That's cool.
Yeah, I have a mirror with me.
But I was working with my therapist at the time, and first it was I stopped what we were doing, and nice. I stopped what we were doing, and we were sort of exploring feelings. We were just hanging out with feelings, and I had to stop things and say, what are we doing? We keep doing the same thing every day. It's the same thing. This is my expressing. And he goes, it sounds like you're a little bit annoyed. I was like,
Mm,
And it was so like a light one. I'm like, yeah, I am annoyed. And then his suggestion was like, let's be with the feeling of annoyance.
mhm,
And I was just like, what? This is so amazing. What a great idea. Let's do that, you know?
mhm,
So as I sit in my body, so this is some somatic work we were
mhm,
doing, and I'm like, okay, I'm annoyed. And very quickly, it's like, no, I'm not annoyed. I'm, I'm, and then I go into
mhm, mhm,
my
mhm,
reservoir, which for me at the time, and still probably now, large,
mhm,
of unfelt feelings.
mhm,
And here it is. It's my anger or it was
mhm,
rage. It was
mhm,
white hot rage. But it was so, and I've had this experience before. Sometimes, like I think in my being, in my person, I'm a little bit stiff emotionally, right?
mhm,
And sometimes it takes like starting here with like annoyance, which is something I can deal with or like
mhm.
cognitively deal with. And then if I sit with it, then it follows a pathway down into something deeper. And is that a process that happens with the empathy set too, or
Yeah, I mean, I think so. What you're describing, Nick, I think is kind of common for a lot of us of needing, in some ways, prompts and encouragement to move toward rather than away from what we're feeling. Um, Honestly, what I've found in many ways sort of amazing, and I've seen also for folks that use the cards, they firstly get surprised when, for example, they identify a particular situation that say that's up for them, and they start exploring what are they feeling, and the cards really are like prompts of just saying, are you yes or no feeling this or not feeling that? And I always say if there's any ambiguity, if you're like, I'm not too sure, and I say, then be generous to yourself, give it to
if
yourself. So then
toss it
you
in?
toss it in, and what people discover at the end of that is like they, instead of just having one feeling, which if you didn't have those prompts, a lot of times that's what I'd observe, is they've got this, wow, I had no idea I had all these feelings. And then a lot of the time there will be, like, for example, I know in the deck there are four cards that speak to that anger sort of continuum. And they may have chosen all four of them. And maybe all of the cards that relate to sadness are also out there. And it's not to invalidate them, but then what after the first sort of go around of saying, what are all of the cards that have some potential application, and saying, all right, now which ones are the ones that are most true to me? And that's where we start funneling and sort of saying, okay, that people spread them all out. Or if you're using the app, there are a couple of little tools that help you to start funneling. And then it's like, so is it annoyance, or is it anger, or am I truly furious? And that sometimes takes a little bit of time. And I think every people have different practices, that people are at different stages along on their path of development in terms of their ability to to do that. But that's, I think it's essentially, it's that sort of journey that people take with themselves of being curious, being open to that discovery, and, like you're saying, going within, listening to their bodies. And then I think what you're sort of sharing is that sometimes how the one can be like the thread that leads to the others. That sometimes you need that little entry point to get you going. And then oftentimes it's like, no. And I always say, so as a mediator, when I say I'll say something like, I sense you are disappointed. Like, no, then I'll say, I'm not like upset that they're telling me no, because what I've done is I've opened the door, and I'll say, so if it's not that, what is it then? And then they'll say, it wasn't that I was disappointed, I was devastated. And I don't argue with them and say, oh no, it should be this or it should be that. um, but again, I think that's what's allowing that space for discovery, for exploration, and again also encouraging people to connect with their bodies, and recognizing that the energy is held within in the body, being curious about that. Really like that sort of expression of making the emotions your friends. And then I think what people also start discovering naturally is, I suppose, certain patterns that we each have as we relate to our emotionality. Um, and again, there's no right and wrong about it, but I think it's just more shifting that mindset from emotion is bad, or when I am feeling emotional, it's been caused externally rather than stimulated externally, and seeing them as helpful sources of energy and information. That to me is the ultimate.
Something I've been wondering about is like, you know, we hear so often about lawsuits. Like there's a big one right now you're probably aware of is the Hollywood Justin Baldoni, Blake Lively lawsuit that's been just everywhere. And like, why do you suppose people don't lean towards mediation? Like, there's a saying that came to me that was like, the ego likes sweets, but sometimes the medicine is bitter. And so it makes me wonder how to like package the medicine in something that looks sweeter, more appealing to people to be like, you think you want this lawsuit, or this is what you think you want, or what you want to win, or what you need, but potentially there's this other option that may be
Hmm.
way, way better. So
Hmm.
what are your thoughts on like why people don't go to mediation, don't consider it, or why their egos may not want to do
Hmm.
that?
Yeah, that is a great question. It is troubling that, as you say, like when people get into a conflict, they don't think of a mediator first. They really think of like someone they can hire to fight on their behalf. So when I'm doing what I would describe as my relational mediations, I use another underrated but very powerful technology, and it's so powerfully simple that we all know it, and all can use it. I call it the line in the sand. You know, where you draw that line in the sand, and essentially by doing that, you create a past and a future, and you say, how do we move as humans beyond the pain of the past? And the one path is the justice path, and that's very alluring. The justice path, as alluring as it is, as I say, it promises a lot, but it often fails to deliver. But initially, when people are experience hurt, or they perceive themselves to have been wrong, that's the first thing. And I think that call, or that desire for justice, is deeply baked into the human's sort of psyche. But as I say, in my experiences, and I think what you're also pointing to, it often doesn't deliver. Um, Actually, currently, I'm working doing a mediation, and a lot of times what uh, will come up is people say, "Well, that was just wrong. You know, that person should be held accountable." And I say to them, so that they're fortunately in mediation, I say, "Yes, I hear you, but if you take that path, is there a guarantee that you're going to get that justice that you want? Or in other words, are you going to get the decision that you want? Because you're essentially putting it in the hands of someone else. And even if you do you think some external judge telling that other person that you're in conflict with is wrong is going to make them say, oh, my word, like here I was thinking I was right all along. Thank you for telling me that I'm wrong. My bad. Let's patch up. At that point, that person is often actually more outraged. So unfortunately, and this is the way I sometimes describe it, I think society as a whole, we've socialized ourselves to be both aggressive and greedy, but also we've been infected by what I call the adversarial virus. And this notion that if I have a conflict, there's that justice path, and then for that justice path to work, it has to be a fight, and it's about right and wrong, and I'm right and you're wrong, and that's the only way we can move on. So when I'm mediating, I put that up there and I'll say to people, here's my line in the sand. That's your one path. I'm not a judge. And if you want to use it, you can, but I'm trying to sort of help them sort of see through that. The other path that I mentioned is the forgiveness path. Now,
Um,
like that. But I also like to see that idea as a possibility of how we can go about addressing things. But uh, as the mediator, I represent what I would call the reconciliation path of helping people to reconcile. But that to me it is the tragedy, is that people spend so much energy, money, time trying to prove that they're right, rather than, there's that lovely Rumi quote of, beyond right and wrong. I'm not getting it quite right, but there's a field, I think it's a field beyond right and wrong, meet me there. And that to me is what mediation is. And so what I try to do is acknowledge their desire for their pound of flesh. And I recently encountered a lovely Confucian Confucius quote where he's apparently said, if you're thinking of revenge, dig 2 graves, because that's normally what happens when you go down that path. So a lot of the time, again, it's in those circumstances, it's meeting the person where they are, acknowledging their outrage that they've been wronged. In other words, validating them, giving them some empathy, and then seeing if you can reappraise their chosen strategy. Again, going back to that anger idea of bringing the energy of saying, how can we channel that energy instead of into fight, but into a more respectful conversation where we listen to one another and seek to understand and acknowledge our respective experiences and discover solutions that work for both of us. So to my mind, I think what you're talking about with whatever cases are clogging up our legal systems are, as I say, more a reflection on society at large that hasn't evolved to that point of seeing the true limitations of that justice path as alluring and as deep that need for some form of, whether it's a justice or accountability or fairness that people call for.
Right. It's such a delicate and nuanced topic. Like the more you're talking about it, I'm like, wow, there's still a lot of layers here. Because on one hand, I think that our need for justice, I've heard, actually is like an existential need in a way. Like children need to feel that the world is just. Because it kind of creates this like sense of safety, right? Without which it's like I think maybe the world might feel too unbearable or too uncertain. And I made this video last night. I was literally talking about that case, and I was saying that it seems that as humans we really struggle with encompassing that there could potentially be two realities, and that both of those realities can actually be simultaneously true, but it's like we're only seeing or identifying with one perspective, and then we tend to see things as black or white, good versus evil. And if we only look at, if we struggle with duality in that way where we can't see the nuances and the shades of gray and the fact that there's light and shadow in everything, even in two people when they're battling it out, I don't know that anyone is ever fully correct, right or wrong, because then you kind of get into this like morality argument. Like past a certain point, morality is what's the word? It's subjective, which is a really wild concept to try to hold, right? It's like, to us, if we're on the planet and there's like a planet-eating monster, we would view ourselves as having the right to live peacefully and not be eaten by the planet-eating monster. But to that monster that needs to eat the planet to save its baby, there's like, you know what I mean? So
Yeah, no.
it's like a wild example. But what I'm thinking of like culturally is that people, it seems like they love the drama, like they can be kind of bloodthirsty, and it makes me wonder if they're not actually engaging in their own hero's journey in a way where they feel engaged or heroic, and so they feel as though they must invest their energy into vicariously living through this like justice system that they see acted out, and that they're actually trying to get something from it. But it's like there's really no winners. I think there's only losers in it if we don't learn compassion, curiosity, and compromise.
Well, I love all of those reflections, Angela, about justice. I think one of the things that comes to mind is that I think you're right. There is that deep need for justice, but I don't know that the path to justice has to be the adversarial fight. And I don't know that that path to justice needs to negate one person's experience over the other. In fact, one of my biggest insights that I found along that path of exploration, it was interesting because I'm preparing for a presentation, and I used to sort of say, well, we'll have what I call the acknowledgement session as needed. And now I really sort of see that it's an essential part of it. And just like you with your hands, I always say as the mediator, that's part of what the mediator does is we're trying to demonstrate I can validate and hold your experience as true for you, validate your perspective and how you experience things, and I can do it for the other person. And I think that sort of almost creates a dissonance in their minds of like, you should be siding with this one or the other. What's going on there? And I think ultimately, in many ways, instead of having that, as I say, that unfortunate kind of justice conversation focused on blame and right and wrong, we shift to the learning conversation. And we discover that almost always when there's a challenge and there is a call for justice, that there were contributions made on each side, and each side has a valid perspective in terms of their experience. And the more we can do that, that frees people from that sort of need to pontificate and say, I'm right. So that's been super for me in terms of my practice. And again, this is where the cards have been a game changer of allowing people to have that moment and to see how they can literally acknowledge the nemesis's perspective as being valid, of seeing like, I may not agree with it, but I can see how you see it that way. And I love your example of the monster, because it's always like that everyone is sometimes expressing themselves in tragic ways, but no matter what conflict we're facing, everyone has feelings about it and everyone has needs associated to it. And so instead of invalidating people's needs and feelings, it's saying, I see these are yours and I see those are yours. And again, as that from that mediator stance, it's we hold that space for both, that non-duality of the truth of the moment.
Right.
With the card, sorry,
Oh,
no, go
sorry.
ahead. Go ahead. Go ahead.
I was going to say, if we're only looking at each other from this side or the other side, it's like we never enter into that third person perspective. There's that saying like, it's like it's like he said, she said, but whoever really knows the truth is like only God knows the truth, kind of, because there's so many like different things that happen, and like there are conversations that aren't had, there's boundaries that aren't drawn, there's triggers that are touched, there's so many components that go into that conflict that are, I think, largely unconscious, that are never surfaced or never spoken about. And so it's really important what you're saying is that we need to kind of challenge our desire to, I think, give in to those triggers and that need for revenge or justice, because I think it is sold as a really sexy thing, especially, in Hollywood, in like The Princess Bride, where Inigo Montoya is like trying to find his father's killer, and there's such a beautiful moment when he like kills him, finally kills the guy responsible. But then there's a moment where he's like, well, now I don't know what to do with my life. I've been in the revenge business for so long. And there was one other point I was wanting to make.
I'll just quickly throw something in because I think you're right. What you're getting at with that interplay between justice and revenge, a lot of times people come seeking, they say they're after justice, but really it's revenge. Now, again, it's hard to point that out to someone, but that's what I've observed, a lot. If you really sort of unravel what's kind of going on, they want their pound of flesh. So again, I'll just to share quickly that when it comes to what I would sort of think of as the reconciliation path, to me, that's premised on acknowledgement. There needs to be acknowledgement of, like just like you were sort of saying, of being able to validate the reality that each person has a valid perspective. There needs to be forbearance. In other words, that people are not coming to fight. They're coming to see if they can work something out. There needs to be empathy. Empathy for the other, but also for ourselves, because when we look in the mirror, and that old dilemma, you point the finger one way and there are three fingers coming back at you. This is one of the things I love, actually, and I've done this with small groups of 2, 3, much larger, and I will get to this point in the conversation about, empathy for the other, yes, and then I say, well, what about self-empathy? And I see this quizzical look on their faces, and what do you mean by that? And I say, well, and I talk about the finger pointing, and then I can see they sort of getting, I say, just this, I think this will really anchor it. I say, if I ask you, how many of you here value honesty and truthfulness? And they're all like, yeah, that's really important. Then I say to them, there's anyone on the Zoom call or in person in this room who's never told a lie or fudged the truth, please raise your hand. And no hands go up. And I say, yeah, it's that kind of self-empathy that we need, where we get off the soapbox of self-righteousness and recognize that we too have contributed to this conflict. And then the other element we need is the recognition of interdependence, and all of that. If we can build on all of that, that positions us for what I'd call that the 3D or the ego conversation about what are we going to do in the world, the problem-solving conversation.
The other thing that I was thinking about wanting to address was, so I think that there can be this idea or argument that if we're like just trying to mediate, that we're not like maybe standing up for ourselves, or we're not focused on accountability. But what I realize is like surrendering the ego's idea of what justice is or what accountability is to that of a higher order, where it's actually true justice or true accountability in ways where these circumstances can be solved, but they're not being solved from a reactionary place, but a responsive place. So it's like releasing those reptilian, animalistic, survival, like I'm going to rip out your jugular and get this revenge that I think I want. It's going to feel so good as I bathe in your blood and just relish it on my skin kind of thing that people I think seem to want and try to do that with money. But to say, I see my urges, my instincts, I can honor that as being human, as being animal, and being instinctual. And I can actually know that while it sounds good or sexy in the moment, that those impulses might not actually serve me or serve anyone else, and that I will surrender to my higher self in a way, and follow through with the steps that I need to do, that my higher self is requiring of me, to speak my truth, stand in my truth, but do so with kindness and compassion. And it doesn't mean that I don't have boundaries. And it doesn't mean that there's no accountability, but it does mean that it's coming from a place of response rather than pure reactivity. Okay, that was all I wanted to say.
No,
Thank
well,
you.
that was beautiful. I think that's beautiful and spot on. And again, I would just sort of say yes, 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 and also to say that the pathway to that higher self is by that befriending and acknowledging our humanity and letting ourselves feel what we need to feel about that situation, not trying to pretend we're not feeling things, because we think that, I think it's called spiritual bypass, like kind of that kind of a thing. So it's being having that humility to be human, to have those feelings, to acknowledge them. What I observe again in my mediations over and over is that when that occurs, it does free people up to come from that higher self place where they're no longer looking for the pound of flesh, and they're seeing it from their higher set of values, and they're approaching it more, as you say, with compassion. And I just recently came across a quote by Thich Nhat Hanh. I'm sure I'm not getting his name right, but where he was essentially saying, compassion doesn't mean that we're a sort of a pushover or we roll over. We can be compassionate and stand up for what is right. But the way we do it, as you're saying, is very different from when we do it like that, as opposed to when we're doing it from our more ego-activated, reactive self.
Yeah, absolutely. So just a synchronistic moment is earlier there was a clip, and it's on my stories right now, but it's Ram Dass interviewing Thich Nhat Hanh, and they're talking about anger and embracing anger as a mother would embrace a child, and just it's been so beautifully synchronistic with this conversation. And thank you so much, Nick, for your patience and allowing me to speak. But I'm so curious to hear what you have to say.
Well, one of the things I think you guys are both describing, and what I'm seeing now is crystallizing in my mind, is like you're taking away this sort of like base reaction that's based out of all these old things, all these old scripts, right? And taking it out of this instinctual sort of animal push out, you hone it back a little bit Then you set out and you elucidate and describe and feel all the parts for both parties, right? And then when all of those things can get acknowledged and you acknowledge yourself and acknowledge your part, and then you take all the pieces and then you can begin to build a 3D strategy of how to move forward once it's all been sort of pulled back a little bit and
Hmm.
acknowledged for everybody. And then you can actually build something where you can take care of everybody, right? Everybody gets
Hmm.
taken care
Hmm.
of, everybody
Hmm.
gets acknowledged, but then you can then build something out of that.
Exactly. Well, again, I think Angela said it well, and you said it as well. In other words, you've both expressed in a different way, and that's beautiful, and I think it's right spot on, Nick, in terms of exactly that. That it does. We can't again bypass, pretend that we don't have that base, more instinctive, ego informed impulse that more often than not does lead us astray. But if we can be humble and do that work and acknowledge it in a way with kindness, and I think then this is also where we then start shifting away from feelings into needs, and then discovering what are our needs. That positions us to do the problem solving and to do it in a respectful way. And again, what I love in situations where people realize, we're not really in conflict. We both want certainty. We both want harmony. We both want respect. We both want to be treated with dignity. And then they start from that higher place, articulating how they're going to get there, and their commitment to it is stronger. But I think that's the opportunity in life. But not an easy path at all.
John, would you go into a bit more of like where the emotional validation aspect like meets needs and how to, because I know sometimes in negotiations, like there can be a compromise, and sometimes people say that it's a successful compromise when like both people are not satisfied, or
Hmm.
and they're like both equally satisfied and dissatisfied or something with the outcome, which
Hmm.
I don't know if that's really has to be true, but I think it's a funny quote. But yeah, just more about like how those two pieces come together.
Sure. So I think the one thing is the feelings are giving us clues as to what we're needing. There's some sort of easy examples, like if a person's tired, you could say they're going to need rest, or if they're confused, they're going to need clarity. But the feelings are often giving the clues as to what people are needing. So I sort of see them going hand in hand. Ultimately, though, I think there's sort of two simple ways we can sort of, I suppose, characterize the conflicts we get in. Some are more relational, interpersonal ones, and then they're more transactional, or what we refer to as sort of distributive negotiations, where it's going to have more of a zero sum feeling to it. That said, what I always encourage is, even though it may appear to be zero sum distributive, there almost always are going to be what we describe in the world of negotiation as integrative moments. So yes, sometimes in a distributive negotiation, the compromise is the best that people can come up with. And I think it's recognizing that. And even when you get into a distributive negotiation, it doesn't mean that the gloves have to come off. There still are principled ways in which people can negotiate to get to let's just call it a fair compromise. But that's a little, that's just sort of the harsh reality of the world that we're in. Those distributive negotiations are very much informed by that adversarial virus that I was talking about. But the real, I think of as more the promise of mediation is especially around what we sort of see as the integrative opportunities, where we're looking for the win-win. And so there's two examples I like giving. The one is this very famous story about two children fighting over an orange. I'll give you a very sort of expedited version, but imagine you come home and your two, offspring are there in the kitchen. They both got their grubby paws on the one orange. There's no orange tree in the yard. There's no 7-Eleven nearby. And you're like, what's going on? And they're like, what do you mean what's going on? I want the orange. And when I ask people, well, what do you do in a situation like that? Most of them are going to say,
Cut the orange in half.
Split the orange, right? Because that's the compromise, and it's a norm that's sort of almost universal that cultures around the world get, that when there's a limited resource that both want, it's fair to split it. And then there's that other lovely lesson that flows from that: the one that cuts doesn't choose. So imagine you've got a boy and a girl. There's the orange. They say, all right. You say, well, you better split it in half. The boy cuts, the girl chews it. She takes her half of the orange and she gets those little, that little glass juicer, and she starts doing this because she's thirsty and she's after orange juice. And your boy, and you'll notice I'm debunking some stereotypes, he takes his half of the orange to the part of the kitchen where you notice it's like the baking section of the kitchen. There's a bowl out, there's flour dusting on the countertop, there's a recipe book out, and he reaches up into the cupboard above and he gets out the grater, and he starts grating the zest of the orange because he's making a cake. So it's a lovely emblematic story from the field of conflict resolution, saying, one, never assume what people need, always be curious and discover what their true needs are. We often shortchange ourselves of that win-win situation, that win-win integrative solution where the kid could have got all of the flesh to make more orange juice, and the other one could have had all of the peel to make his cake extra zesty. So that's the first one, is saying, be careful about making assumptions. But the second one is also helping people to see that when we get into conflict, being positional, like I want, this is like old barbaric way of approaching things, and we justify it. This is why, and the other one says, no, this is why, and off we go, boom, boom, like this. It's bruising and it doesn't feel good. So what we try to do in a more, I won't say enlightened, but sort of insightful approach to conflict is to say, why is it that you're making this demand? And we go beneath the surface and discover, oh, you need the flesh because you're thirsty. Oh, you need the peel because you're hungry. And then we get these integrated solutions. So my sort of notion is, whenever we're in a conflict, we always want to hold the space for integrative solutions. They're always there if we look for them. And sometimes they're the heart of the conflict. And if we can then come up with our smartest, wisest, most creative solutions. When it comes to those distributive ones where we need to, more for you is less for me, zero sum, then we need to look for external standards that are fair, that guide us as to what's a fair amount. Like when we're buying a secondhand motor vehicle, there's Kelly Blue Book that gives us a sense of what's fair in those circumstances. And I'll end with another little sort of story that really, because it comes back to your question more about the needs piece. So some years ago, it was around about just prior to it was actually in the dot-com boom era. So I live in Oakland, California, and I got asked by the city of Oakland to mediate between a tenants association and the owners of an apartment block. And the dispute centered on money. There were new owners and they were trying to get these long-term tenants. Some had been there 20, 30 years out. Oakland's a rent-controlled city. And the new owners were trying to get these long-term tenants out so they could refurnish it or modernize it and put it back on the market at a higher rental. So that was the real dispute. And we had one meeting at City Hall, made some progress. Meeting two, I get there, I set things up. The owners arrive, we sit down, we're waiting, and we're like, oh, you think they're going to come? A good 40 minutes late, they walk in, and they were an elderly bunch. And probably the oldest of them said, he sort of like banged his hand out. He said, from now on, all the meetings have to be at the apartment block. So you see, he made a demand. So I was like, whoa, I didn't see that one coming. But I didn't say to him, like, come on, like, what's wrong with you, right? I acknowledged that he was, there was some frustration. I said, can you share a little bit more? He said, yes, as you can see, we're elderly. To get from the apartment block to downtown Oakland, to find parking, then to get to the building, then to find which room we're in, it's really, really difficult. So again, I immediately I said, wow, that does sound frustrating. And I said, and it sounds like you need an easily accessible venue. And he's like, yeah, exactly. And then again, as the mediator, right, because there's two realities, as you were pointing out, I'm not going to just leave it with the one. I turn to the owners and say, well, what about you guys? They say, well, our office is in San Jose. We get in the BMW, we race up the 101, drive across the bay, park, come into the building, not a problem, right? So for them, they were way further away, but easy access wasn't the issue. And there were two of them, and the younger of the two said, but you know what? We've had meetings at the apartment block before, and every time we've met there, it's like the tenants who've lived there forever have home field advantage. So now I think you can see, right? The one side needs an easily acceptable venue. Sorry, accessible, not acceptable, acceptable and accessible. And the owners, they needed a neutral venue. So now instead of it being a fight, it's saying, oh, now we need to look for a venue that's neutral and easily accessible. And I say, let's brainstorm. What are your ideas? And it takes a little bit of time. It doesn't take too long before someone said, well, you know what? Next to the apartment block, there's a church. And on the church premises, there's a meeting hall. It's neutral and it's easily accessible. And we're on our way. So that to me is really, again, that sort of coming back to the power of focusing on needs, but getting to the needs is more like the reward that we get to once we've done a lot of that harder work of dealing with those uncomfortable emotions. If we don't do that right, that's often the tragedy. There's a solution waiting for people that higher self, the higher selves will find. But if they're embroiled at that more base ego level, they're not going to get there. And so it's by another analogy I sometimes use is, if you fall on a spike and you've punctured your thigh and you need stitches and you go to the emergency room and they're about to stitch it up, and they haven't cleaned it out, you'll be like, whoa, 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 you need to clean this thing out first before you stitch it up. So it's the same to me. The cleaning of the wound is doing that hard emotional acknowledgement work. And then once we've done that, then we can do the stitching, which is the problem solving. And to do that, we need the needs. And once we've got the needs, that's when the solutions follow.
That's beautiful. Amazing. I loved all those examples. You know, John, what if we were to hire you to help mediate the gap, the chasm between our two political parties? America needs you.
No, I'll just say, I wish I could. I mean, it's been interesting. I've discovered to my horror some friends of mine that I had made assumptions about. And in this time, for me, I recognized, it took me a while to get to this point, that I actually needed some empathy myself, that I didn't want to hold that middle ground of seeing both sides, that I had been in some senses triggered, and I needed to have my wish for my pound of flesh. And I'm still working on that. I haven't quite got out there. So truthfully, yeah, it is a real dilemma, because again, if we come back to what you're sort of saying, it's hard for me to say this, but there's truths
Yeah.
on both sides, and instead of constantly demonizing one another, can we start working together to find the common ground? And as I say, I know I'm not that, but I think that's. I mean, it's needed on planet Earth, not just here.
Yeah.
To my mind, we're still the sort of human consciousness is sort of pegged at an ethnocentric sort of level of my tribe versus your tribe, me versus you, and we haven't got to that higher consciousness of I suppose unity consciousness, of seeing the oneness, to see in the person that I'm pointing the finger at myself, and to have compassion for them, and also have compassion for myself, judging them in the way that I do. So anyway, I've been struggling, and as I say, I've concluded that I also matter, and I need to sort of be able to have my moment of despair.
Mm. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Absolutely.
John, I want to thank you for all your time today. I know you got to get to a mediation. I don't want to keep you too
Yes.
long. I just wanted to thank you for hanging out with this today, and sharing yourself and your expertise and your lovely tools. And the empathyset.com is a very cool website. I want to encourage everybody to check out.
Hard
The
decks.
cards are also very cool, and just much appreciate you for reaching out and hanging out with us today and having a great conversation.
Yes. Thank you, John.
Yeah, thank you both. Thank you, Nick. Thank you, Angela. It's been fun getting to know you. Good connecting with your open hearts and your care in the world. your desire to help, because I do think it is a real dilemma in society, the mischaracterization of the emotional dimension of life, and appreciate the way you're helping others to open up to it and giving them insights through your variety of your great podcasts to help with that, because I think, as you like to say, we are all so very emotional, aren't we?
Yes, we are. Absolutely.
Yes, we are. So thanks, guys. It was a
All
treat.
right. Thank you. So emotional. That's it.
That's a wrap. Bye, y'all.